First of all, it's a bold claim to make that Swordburst 3 has little potential. I'd like to clarify that this doesn't mean the game won't be successful. In regards to crafting an experience that will cater to Roblox, Alex doesn't need any pointers from me. The critical point here is that Swordburst 3 is not looking to be a quality game. I could picture it in the top charts in the near future, but I wouldn't consider playing it, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone I know. Maybe to some people that's okay, maybe you can picture the same game as me, but instead you're also there enjoying it to its full potential. That's fine. I've long accepted that the quality standards on Roblox are, generally speaking, pretty low across the board. And that's not to chide developers who make games without the same checks and balances you'd expect from actual game studios. The amateurish aspect of Roblox is often the most appealing element for a lot of people, myself included.
God. Wait, are you on it?
The difference when it comes to Swordburst 3 is that Alex is not an amateur. In fact, though I don't know many of them, I wouldn't consider it far to suppose that all of the Swordburst 3 dev team are experienced in their craft, which is why I have no issue holding the game to such a high standard and saying that it lacks potential. The easiest word to summarize people's thoughts on Swordburst 3, specifically on why they don't like it, is execution. The concept is all there, it's the execution that's bothering everybody. This is good because, in a broad sense, tinkering with a game's execution is magnitudes easier than wrestling with its very concept. In other words, the issues with Swordburst 3 can be solved in this early alpha. In fact, it's kind of imperative that they're addressed now of all times. I don't want to hear the classic, "it's an alpha, don't be so harsh," because that's completely counterintuitive to the entire purpose of alpha staging a game. As a developer, you'd want the most feedback now, given how much easier it is to make sweeping changes to a heavy work in progress. And more likely than not, the changes will have to be sweeping, considering all the issues I'm about to discuss. I think it's interesting that one of the most echoed responses to Swordburst 3's poor execution is that it feels like a simulator, which is to say that it shouldn't feel like a simulator. And I hope I don't need to explain why this is a bad thing. If you've ever played a simulator before, you understand that your time is valued elsewhere. The aspects of Swordburst 3 that draw its ties to a simulator happen to be the same ones that also stunt player freedom. Every time you want to do something in this game, there's a level check involved. As a result, you literally cannot progress in any way that will distinguish you from someone else, besides choosing to farm a boss or not. This means that, in addition to the extra linear map design, there's an extremely linear progression experience that all players must go through. If you haven't noticed, that's basically what a simulator is. Everyone goes through the same slog of doing the exact same thing over and over until they meet the next requirement to do more of the exact same thing. There's no creative exercise to it. You don't have to make any decisions or do any research about anything. It's all laid out for you. Now, suppose what the opposite of this might be. Imagine a floor 1 where all the content to experience expands out from the center of spawn, forming a circular shape, with the dungeon located somewhere on the edge. There's a few starter quests that get you acquainted with your abilities, but after that you're told to kick it. It's your job to get out there and find what the hell you want to do. No optimal path and no level locked areas. If you find yourself in a spot way over your level, you'll realize pretty quick. The difference is, instead of being blocked out of even seeing the place, you could use your experience there to inform your decisions later on, once you're a higher level. Or maybe you decide to organize a group and tackle the spot together, pulling out on top. I'm not saying this is exactly how Swordburst should evolve, but you and I can both imagine how much more exciting the game could be when we're not forced into doing one specific thing. But maybe that's a bit of a tall order. I'll be the first to admit that in game development, the most exciting ideas usually demand the greatest workloads. As for that, there's a happy medium to be found, or rather, there already exists a happy medium that we all know. I know that some people are sick of hearing Swordburst 2's name in this context, which is a little weird considering how the games are of the same franchise, but aside from that, the value of considering Swordburst 2's techniques should not be underestimated in the development of Swordburst 3. That happy medium I was talking about, well, if the third game's progression looks like this, then the second game's looks like this. It's still overall a linear path, but along the way there's much more wiggle room for a player to do what they want as opposed to what they should. As for openness, it's a far cry from the theoretical circular floor I discussed earlier, but it's still leagues better than what we have now. A fine solution has always existed here, and all that needed to be done was a little iteration and expansion on the concept, and it would have suited a sequel nicely. Instead, it's like we got the backwards form of that, something that might appeal better to a very young audience, but not to the fans already predisposed to be playing Swordburst 3 in the first place. When you look at everything from this angle, it becomes clear why people wish for the old ways of Swordburst 2. Having chance drops from mobs and not just bosses, something that is currently absent in Swordburst 3, is another variable that can set apart people's experiences during the game and also influence the choices they make. You might catch a lucky break by getting a rare drop, maybe a few for your friends too. If that doesn't happen, you might consider an alternative mob to grind that drops a higher capped weapon at a higher chance. Instead, when everything is a shop item or dropped by a boss, it becomes extremely obvious when and why you should get your next weapon. Again, this will feel like a barrier to pass and leave very little room for players to organically discover the way forward. I hope this is all making sense, because this line of reasoning is an easy way to illustrate the issues people are having. Things like the linear map design, simplified upgrade system, and borderline copy-pasted quests are all points pertaining to the lack of player freedom. And it's funny, because not all things were worked backwards in this fashion. The combat is a major comeuppance from Swordburst 2, and the reworked enemies are nice, if a little rough at the moment. It just feels like those were the only gameplay elements treated with any sort of creativity, while the rest is what we have now. The next topic, style and aesthetics, is a difficult one to handle. There is a general distaste for the way Swordburst 3 looks, mainly because it's such a departure from Swordburst 2, a game with a style I can best describe as safe. This safe style is essentially a variation from the default texture look that is adopted by a lot of other Roblox games of around the same era. I call this style safe not because it's overdone, but because it's heavily grounded on Roblox as a whole. For many, there's a sense of familiarity here, which does a lot to make it easy to appreciate or at least tolerate. Now enter the cartoony look of Swordburst 3. Inherently, I can't say there's much wrong with what we have. Given Swordburst 3 was its own standalone thing, like World 0, I feel most people in contention with the style would easily move on to other experiences. However, since that's not the context we're dealing with, there's definitely more to consider here. I haven't heard many specifics as to why people don't like how Swordburst 3 looks, but if I had to put it succinctly myself, I'd say that it's because it looks like a mobile game. And I'm talking about very early mobile games, where if there were any complex textures at all, they'd have to be slashed down in resolution to keep the download reasonable. There are countless examples illustrating this in-game, especially with the non-organic textures and models like structures and buildings. To really hammer home my perspective, I decided to remodel the teleport pad in Studio using a style more representative of the rest of the series. Here they are side by side. The style of Swordburst 3 also possesses issues that rise above simply being too cartoony or the like, and here's a rapid fire round of those. Swordburst 3 is unapologetically bright at times. It got to a point while playing where looking away from the game would sometimes produce a noticeable after image simply because of how bright something was. This isn't really something I need to explain. If you play the game, you can spot these blinding areas yourself. Proposing a fix, consider making some of the brightest areas the darkest instead. If you took places like the crystal caves, dimmed their lighting significantly, and created highlights via the glowing of crystals and mobs, then you'd end up with a much more dynamic setting as opposed to the washed out appearance we have now. There's an arguable level of dissonance between themed areas in Floor 1, with a handful of spots feeling out of place or hard to justify amongst the rest of the floor. This is especially true in the dungeon, which may sound weird considering that it's entirely disconnected. However, aside from having crystals in a cave, the dungeon itself doesn't borrow or share any thematic consistency with the rest of the floor. The funny thing is, this issue is mostly because Floor 1 itself doesn't really have an identity to begin with. It's an incredibly generic space even for being the classic starting zone of a video game. Floor 1 and Swordburst 2 had towering trees and large natural features like cliffs and lakes, with an overall overgrown feel. It wasn't a groundbreaking design, but it still had more to offer in appearance than what Floor 1 has now. This one is kind of funny to me because I think it's really obvious that all the UI is so overblown for the sake of mobile compatibility. I don't need so much of my screen real estate being taken up by buttons that are bound to keys such that you don't even need to click them. It's interesting that the stamina bar is featured as a billboard GUI next to the player. At first this may seem like a good thing. Consider that you'll be staring at your character for most of your playtime, and you may find it convenient that vital information such as your stamina is also right there. That being said, equally as vital information such as burst cooldowns and your health are altogether at the bottom of the screen. Coupled with the fact that it's very easy to lose the relatively small stamina bar amongst a lot of action, I think it would just be better if stamina was included with everything else. It may seem odd to stop myself this early, but I should emphasize that if my goal was to address every problem with Swordburst 3, we'd be here for a long time. So I chose 2 topics that best represent what people dislike about the current alpha. With that, if you're curious as to the full extent of what there is to know, I'd suggest joining the Swordburst 3 Discord, which will be in the description. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I can't recommend buying the game, so this is your best option so long as you're not looking to get the alpha benefits, which are unknown at this time. Though it wasn't my intention when I set out on this video, I do sort of realize that this is basically an open letter to the developers of the game. In the same way that every 4-paragraph suggestion in the Discord is also kind of an open letter, I don't expect this video to be any different and elicit some sort of change. The devs of Swordburst 3 are very quiet right now, and the only thing they've communicated at this time is that they're working on Floor 2 and the beta. As far as I know, they have not publicly acknowledged the immense backlash, and I don't count one-off messages from a dev addressing someone's concerns in general chat. There's nothing in announcements, nothing on Twitter, and nothing on the group page. This is the state of the game right now. It's pretty bleak. I'll be keeping in touch with the project to see what changes, but you decide if doing the same is worth your time. Other than that, there's really not much else to say. I don't have a lot of hope for the future of this project, but maybe Alex can prove me wrong. Thank you for watching. This was my first time making an actual video, so I hope it wasn't too shit. Peace out.